One of the things I'm going to do is actually show you that I have an Intellisense experience right within the browser. So the type of experience that you expect when writing code, you get right here in the browser. We have the ability to navigate through symbols a little bit here. So I can actually see, and you can see it actually flips through the document as I navigate that document. We have things like find, of course. We have the bigger find in files, which you can see that I'm getting results across scripts as well as default.html. Find and replace, of course, and so on. In fact, we have quite a bit of functionality in here, and I'm going to bring up our quick open, which will actually show you that we have a number of key bindings. It's kind of fun to kind of browse through that and see what there is, but there's actually a lot of functionality in a web-based browser. Or sorry, a browser-based editor. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this app, which I'll run for you real quick here, or hopefully will be real quick, and we're always at the mercy of the network, and especially in conferences where you have a ton of people with like 3 devices each. I'll talk into the internet. You can kind of never know what you're going to get, but this is essentially packaging this up, putting it on SharePoint as the host to keep things simple. And then it'll open up the web version of Excel. So again, we don't need to install any software, including the Office clients, to actually build this app for Office. All right, great. So it launched. And here it's going to bring up a credential dialog. You ever notice that typing in a password is a little bit harder when you're doing a presentation? All right, here we go. So it's actually really simple. There's a couple buttons that interact with the document, so I can set data, and so that sets the data in the selected cell. I can go to a different cell and say, hello, VS Live, and I can get that data, and it'll input it into that text box. So just showing the integration with the document. So what we're going to do with this is actually leverage that, but instead of just taking that single line of text and putting it in a text box, we'll create that bubbles visualization. So let's go back to the editor here, and I'm going to copy some code here. I got a variable that I'm going to use down here, which will contain the values. And what I'm going to do is take this snippet of code, which essentially what it does is after, well, actually, let me talk about this. So this line of code essentially writes the value that I got from the cell that was selected into that text box. So I'm going to nuke that, and instead of that, I'm going to create a YQL query that I'm going to send to the Yahoo stock service, which will return me the values for each one of the stocks that I entered. Now, I had the coercion type of text here before, which I'm going to actually change to matrix, because I want to input multiple stock symbols. Now, down here, after we get the stocks back, it calls a method called showCanvas, which I'll grab out of here as well, which is very simple. It just essentially gets a div that I actually put or will put in the HTML file. So really simple. The actual drawing is performed by a library called processing.js, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that's what I need in my app.js file. When I go to default.html, I just have a couple of simple things. Oh, I forgot my cache values. So the Yahoo service actually will throttle you over time, and I've been practicing a bunch here, so just in case, we will put that in as some cache values. And then there's, back in the HTML file, I need a script reference to the processing library, which I also need to add in a second, and that div canvas that I referenced in the app.js file. So go down here and plunk that in. So easy as that. Now, one of the things that I need is, one of the things that I need is the processing.js library. Now, I just downloaded this off of the processing.js website. It's just an open source JS library that does a lot of cool, neat visualizations on things. And then I need bubbles.txt, which is essentially the processing language that describes how the bubbles should look and act, and so on. So I'll drag those in. And as simple as that, I've got everything going. So this time I'll run again. Should be a little bit quicker this time because we only upload the change files and not the whole package on the second run. So crossing my fingers here, let's have it go. And again, oh great, look at that. So I'll bring up Excel again. And what I'll do is I'll enter some stock ticker symbols. We'll choose Microsoft, of course, because I always need to keep track of that. We'll use Yahoo since we're using their service, and we'll throw in some Facebook as well. So I'll multi-select those, and I'll select Get Data, and boom, just like that, you see the processing, actually let me bring this up, the processing JS library is doing the drawing and doing the heavy work for me, but we integrated with the Yahoo service and created this visualization over that data. So simple as that. One of the key messages here is that, hey, I didn't install any software, did it completely in the browser, didn't need Office, didn't need Visual Studio. Of course, you know, we hope this hooks you and you will get Office and Visual Studio, but if you don't already have it already. And the other thing I can do here is I can actually share this project, which is kind of neat and fun too. So I can go to share. This will create a public link. Actually, I can do this. I can actually click share, and it'll create a public link that all of you can access to actually look at that code. Let's see, so it's aka.ms/ts4kam. You can hit that URL and actually bring up this project right inside of Napa. But Napa is fairly limited, and it's pretty new, and we're excited about it, and we see some forward-looking potential with it, but it's really just a getting started tool. So how do you continue your development once you decide that you want to build apps for Office and SharePoint? Well, you want to use Visual Studio, and we've made it really seamless to move to Visual Studio. So you click Open in Visual Studio here, and it actually uses the web platform installer to download any tools that you need to actually run this project inside of Visual Studio 2012. And then it launches Visual Studio, it downloads the project, launches Visual Studio, and opens it up to that project. Now, one of the things that I want to show you here is that really hammers home an app for Office or SharePoint is just a web page plus manifest. Well, we have two projects here. One is a Bubbles project, and that's an app for Office project, and if I double-click on this XML file, it brings up a manifest editor. The other project is Bubbles Web, and this is a standard ASP.NET web project. So you're just going to build out this web project using the ASP.NET skills that you know and deploy it to a web server, and that's essentially how you build this apps for Office. All right, so that's my demo of building an app for Office. Some of the key takeaways are that, look, you can leverage your existing skills as an ASP.NET developer. It is really no different, but you get a different entry point into services that you're building, or maybe services that already exist. So you can build entry points inside of different Office applications. You can keep your users inside the applications that they're already using and retain that context. All right. So with that, let's now flip over to Apps for SharePoint and do a quick overview of building an app for SharePoint and, well, what Apps for SharePoint are. Similar to Apps for Office, Apps for SharePoint have three shapes. Apps for Office were a little bit different in that Apps for Office are a little bit more either-or, although I did show you combining some of them up. Apps for SharePoint literally usually are a full-page app accompanied by the other shapes, parts, and UI command extensions, although on occasion you do see part-only apps for SharePoint. So the first one, we'll play around with this one a little bit. It's just actually something I built. It doesn't really exist. You can see the Contoso at the top, which is Microsoft's fake company that we used. It's approved by our legal company to use as a name, our LCA legal department, essentially. So this is actually showing a business application that you would have in your company. So instead of emailing your admin or going over to their office or desk and saying, hey, can you order me, I don't know, an Asus laptop or a Dell desktop, you could actually do this over the web, and it would be very easy to build up one of these types of business applications. Secondly, and you can see that it takes over the whole page. Now, I guess the question on the first one, and the thing that I want to prove to you is that it's interesting to build this not as a web app, but as an app for SharePoint instead. Now, the second example is a Locations Mapper app, which is available in the store, which is kind of a fun one. Actually, what it does is it just has a list on SharePoint. You input some locations. It creates a page for you, a full-page app, essentially, that you can go to that has push pins on those locations. So, for example, if you're doing a map of some of your corporate buildings, you could do that really simply just by leveraging SharePoint and this app. You can see here, I've push pinned a couple of the buildings around Microsoft. And third, what I showed you already, Napa. It's an app for SharePoint. It's an app for SharePoint that lets you build apps for Office and apps for SharePoint. So kind of recursive there, but you get the idea. Takes over the whole experience. Parts are probably pretty familiar to most people nowadays. You know, here's a part on the bottom here, a weather part. You add parts. It's included in the payload of the package for an app. And there's an entry point in the Office ribbon, or the SharePoint ribbon in this case, to add that particular app. And then UI command extensions, kind of similar to parts, but extending the ribbon, the SharePoint ribbon. In this case, this is the Nintex Workflow Designer, which is a cool app, actually. And what it does is it installs a couple of ribbons tabs at the top of the ribbon. So again, apps for SharePoint. Web page or web project plus manifest information. Actually, it has other information there as well that you can use. SharePoint artifacts like lists, workflows, and other things which are deployed to SharePoint equals your app. SharePoint is slightly different in that you have a couple different hosting options. Now, there's really only two here. One is you have a web server, and two is you don't. But there's two flavors of the first one. So when you look at the cloud-hosted app, it's actually very similar to what I showed you with the apps for Office. You have SharePoint, the server, where you can deploy things to, like lists, workflows, and so on, that SharePoint understands, as well as the app manifest. And SharePoint understands that app concept and brings up a web page off of your web server. And so you can manage your web server, and that's what we call provider-hosted. You bring your own web server. And the thing that I'm going to talk about here today is, and hopefully between yesterday and today, you'll see that Windows Azure is the best web server for your needs here. Or there's auto-hosted, which again, you have a server running your web project. But the difference with auto-hosted is that SharePoint actually manages deployment out to Azure under the covers. And SharePoint manages its own SharePoint little cluster that it has with its own domain. And you don't have access to that. But the benefit of the auto-hosted app, and it's good for smaller apps, is that you don't have to worry about hosting. So instead of trying to find a web server to deploy to, which can sometimes be difficult in companies, it's getting easier, but sometimes can be difficult, or maybe you just don't want to have to pay for a particular web server over time, well, just push that onto SharePoint, and the people that are paying SharePoint, it's included as part of Office 365, is the ability to have some web hosting included as well. So that's really the difference, and we'll show you both over the course of this presentation. Oh, and then the other one, SharePoint hosted, well, SharePoint kind of is a web server itself, and so you're just kind of combining the two. But one of the key points about the SharePoint hosted app, which is a little simpler, which I'll start there because it is simpler. One of the key points about that is you can only do client-side code, meaning you can't do .NET in a SharePoint hosted model. You can't do server code. You can do HTML, CSS, JS, and so on. And the reason for that is we have a principle around these apps, and it's actually the same for Office and SharePoint, which is, and we always use the notion of, hey, if you installed 1,000 apps, it shouldn't impact the hosting application, be it SharePoint, Word, Excel, and so on. And so in terms of SharePoint, if you installed 1,000 apps that had server code, well, you're probably going to bring down SharePoint as those apps run. So we said, OK, we made the hard call and said, OK, well, in SharePoint, these apps for SharePoint, you can only do client-side code because it runs in the browser. It won't impact SharePoint. So that's the principle behind that, and that's how it manifests in terms of this app model. So let's build an app for SharePoint, and we'll start in Visual Studio. Actually, we'll start where we were back here with this Bubbles app, but I'll create a new project, and we'll create an app for SharePoint. And we'll call it the Hardware Purchasing app, kind of playing off that sample that I showed you earlier. And you can see when I create this app, it asks me, how do you want to host your app for SharePoint? Do I want to auto-host it, provider host it, or SharePoint host it? Well, I'm going to choose SharePoint hosting, again, because it's the simplest, and then we'll move on from there. So that's going to create my project. Oh, it's going to ask me to log in as well, so it's actually talking to that SharePoint dev site that I had already set up there. And now it's going to connect and finish creating that project. And after the project is finished, let's talk about the code real quickly. There's a little bit of style sheet stuff that I get at the top here, or master page, to give me the Chrome and SharePoint look and feel. But aside from that, it's actually pretty simple. I have a div with a message in here called initializing, and the JS will actually change that once the app has finished loaded to say hello and user.getTitle, which is actually an important aspect of this app, which I'll talk to as soon as we get it running. So I'm going to F5. This is going to package up the app. It's going to put it in the cloud in Office 365, which actually brings up a good point. If you've ever done SharePoint development, you're probably used to installing SharePoint locally on your dev machine, which I do not, if you haven't done that, I don't recommend you go do that for fun, because it's not fun. And as well as it requires a pretty big memory, and it requires a beefy machine, essentially. So SharePoint developers should be pretty happy that for these apps for SharePoint, we've fully enabled remote development against the cloud instead. OK, so here's the app. Here's the Chrome at the top. You get the SharePoint look and feel, so it feels very integrated SharePoint, but that was very easy. The key point here is it says hello Jim at nacga.onmicrosoft.com. And the reason why this is interesting is that auth and identity are built into the app model. So if you're building a web app, actually that might be the reason why you actually build this app as an app for SharePoint instead of just a plain web app for your company, because you get auth and identity built in. And that's only where it begins. Not only do you get auth and identity, but you can start leveraging SharePoint search, lists, workflows, and so on. So you can start leveraging SharePoint as services in your app development. Now, you don't have to. So if you actually just want to build a regular website, but surface it through SharePoint, so your users actually have a unified single place, and you get app management and other things that I'll show you in a little bit, you can do that as well. In fact, you can take existing web projects, even URLs, and make them apps for SharePoint very easily. All right, so let's go back to the project. And one of the things I'm going to do is if I'm actually building out this hardware purchasing app, I don't want a SharePoint hosted. I actually want to, let's say I want to start with auto hosting. So I'll say yes. Now what that's doing is it's actually adding a web project to this solution, as you might expect, similar to what we saw with apps for Office. And again, the notion that, hey, this is just web app development. It's just ASP.NET. I could use ASP.NET Web Forms. I could use MVC. I can use Razor. Whatever I want to use, I can do it right here. And whatever I'm familiar with, I can use right here. And the skills that I use are essentially very transferable to other domains as well. So SharePoint is becoming, Office and SharePoint is becoming much more, the skills that you, or sorry, the skills that you have are much more transferable, and Office and SharePoint development is becoming much more mainstream. All right, so I have this web app, and what am I going to do? So I can do anything I can do in an ASP.NET web app, I can do right here. And actually, just to prove that to you, I will add, I'll open the new item dialog, where you can see that I have web forms and web API and master pages and all the other things that I would expect from ASP.NET. The other thing I can do is leverage SharePoint capabilities, and I've alluded to lists and workflows and other things. So let's do that, because what I want to do is actually add a list, and we'll call it the hardware list. So this will be the list of approved hardware, the curated set of hardware that is available to me. So I'll click Finish, and what I get is a list designer experience right within Visual Studio. And so if I'm actually creating this hardware list, I'll probably need some kind of ID. I'll probably want to have a description, and so I can take some of those, and so on and so forth. The other thing that I can do is I can add a remote event receiver. And what that does is it allows me to, and you can see I have workflows and other things, but I'll add a remote event receiver, which allows me to respond to a situation where a new item is being added to this list. So you can see that hardware list is already selected as the event source. I'll say an item's being added. I'll click Finish. And boom, I get a remote event receiver added. I have .NET code that I can use on the server to actually handle that case. And it might be interesting to email the company when a new piece of hardware is available to be purchased. I can also run approval workflows. I can tie into back-end systems. All those are made possible through both SharePoint and this web project. So it can continue developing this. You can see that I go as far as here. I'll just flip to the other app. I have one built out. I used actually a lot of Razor to build this. You can see I have C# embedded here. I have that event receiver, and so on and so forth.